As ready as I will probably ever be. So.
Yeah, same. Let's see. The real thing that's weird about this, or I always find super weird about this, is like seeing whether the video, or sorry, like there's a delay, of course, right? So now, if you go back, like this should be live. Oh, there it is. Now it's live, you know. But you have anyway, every time I put a stream live, I have like 5 seconds of like, did it work? What I don't want to say, you know, I don't want to like do a, hey guys,
Is
intro.
that the time gap? About 5 seconds between what's going out live and what you're actually saying right now?
Yeah. Yeah, so if I say anything completely insane, you let me know and I'll just like I'll pull the plug out from my computer.
Yeah, do you have someone next to you just like hit a button
Ready?
to censor the language or anything?
No. Oh, that's probably a good idea.
I want the camera to just pan to the side and just see like a whole crew of like tech people.
Yeah, there's like a
AV guys, you know.
Man, the problem is that I am the AV guy. It's like the tragic reality of 2021. All right, so the idea behind, to give some context to those who are watching, of which there will likely be at least a few, or who knows, this is going to be exist for all of history. Uh, the idea was to effectively have people who, problem is that you do know more than you pretend to know about Urbit, ask me about Urbit and make me explain Urbit to them. Just as partially as an exercise for me, and also to see whether it's even possible.
Look, we have, not to interrupt you, but we have had conversations about Urbit, more than one over the
Yeah.
past. And every time I talk to somebody else about Urbit, I say the same thing, which is Galen and I have spoken about Urbit a number of times, and I still don't understand,
Okay.
really.
See, exactly. That's
So,
actually that's the criteria for who I try and get to do this with me, which is like, you're like, yeah, it's I don't know. You should just ask Galen. Anyway. Uh, so for those watching, this is my friend Dan. We went to school together, and Dan makes all kinds of things, generally creative. I think of you as a filmmaker, but you make all kinds of stuff. So not technical, maybe is the most important. Understands technology, managed to install and run Urbit at one point, but not like deeply technical.
yeah, that not deeply technical is a good way of putting it. I would say I'm probably decidedly 20th century in my technological abilities.
Yeah, I support that. That's good. Okay, so anyway, the way I always I actually don't even really know how to frame this conversation most productively, but maybe the best thing is whenever I'm like, it's kind of like I'm at a bar, which I'm never at a bar, but imagine that I would be at a bar. Someone's like, "What do you do?" or something like that. Uh, I think usually I first ask people questions about kind of like, well, what do yeah, what do they do and where are they coming from to like understand what they already know about technology or how they, it's like if someone's like, oh, I'm a systems programmer, I'm like, oh, well, let's talk about the technology. If someone's like, oh, I'm a lawyer. Anyway, there's a whole, it sort of depends on where they're coming from. But maybe the question for you is like, how much do you already know about this thing? Because you don't know nothing about it.
Well, I mean, most of what I know about it is, just following the work of a friend from college. Just at some distance, some remove. I think keeping tabs on things, I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage because I don't use any social media stuff. So I know that, Urbit has a bit of a community and following on something like Twitter. But,
Yeah.
every now and then I'll just like drop in on the browser and like see what people are talking about or look at some cool pictures, whatever they
Yeah.
get posted. But no, actually, the reason I think I got really excited about the project when I first heard about it was because what you're describing was something that I'd probably thought about like myself countless times prior to knowing that you were even working on it. I think we kind of accept that things are the way they are, but then it's like for some people, it's like you start to ask like, well, why is it the way it is, and why does it have to be that way? And you kind of imagine a better alternative, but I'm not the person who's going to invent that or,
Yeah.
manifest it in the real world. So.
Yeah. I mean, some of it's probably true for me too. But you mean related to like how people communicate digitally, I guess, like, or is there something specific about like Urbit itself that you're referring to? Just so I understand.
Well, I mean, I'm a person who I appreciate when things can be streamlined. You know, I don't always, I don't know, when you notice things that are like superfluous,
Yeah.
I kind of ask myself like, why do I need two of these when I can have one? You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you think about just having a normal internet existence, for the past decade or so, it's like
Yeah.
there's things that you do, people who you communicate with, things that you want to share,
Yeah.
um, materials that you want to exchange, and then every time you need something different, you need a Gmail so you can access all the Google stuff. You need a
Yeah.
Dropbox because someone else doesn't use Google Drive; they only use Dropbox.
Yeah.
Your friend who makes music only puts their stuff on SoundCloud, and then the
Yeah.
other friend only puts things on Bandcamp or whatever.
Yeah.
And I feel like look at any person's like password manager, in their browser, it's just like a mess. It's like I can't keep track of all that stuff. You
Yeah,
know, I
yeah,
mean, if the browser wasn't doing it for me, I'd be lost. So
yeah,
yeah, you just start to notice like, why is this online existence starting to feel so cluttered and so trashy in a weird way,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it feels shitty, right? It's like
Yeah,
so
yeah, it really does.
so low quality. Yeah.
But then when you feel dependent on that stuff, you start to ask yourself, well, all these things that, make up my digital identity, when I see them, I feel like they look kind of trashy or kind of shitty. So
Yeah.
maybe I'm kind of trashy or shitty. And
Yeah,
I
it like
don't
reflects
want to think of
poorly.
myself that
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Uh, that's like our biggest mark. That's like a good, succinct way of describing like the Urbit marketing opportunity or something. It's like you can live in, you can, yeah, it's like it reflects poorly on you. Like it's lowbrow to live in the world of kind of like conventional services. You know, like Urbit is like the premium alternative. Probably not yet, but like that's the idea. Um, okay, so this reminds me basically that like one of the most difficult to explain, but probably like most important things to understand about Urbit um, that I think I'm getting somewhat better at explaining. Like I used to, for a while, would like kind of avoid trying to explain this because it is a little bit technical and kind of confusing. And then I realized, okay, there's really no other way. You have to understand this. Um, but I think the explanation can be improved. So maybe that's a good place to start. So basically, like, sure, you have all this, everyone has all this stuff, this like multitude of different uh, accounts and services and whatever. And the only reason for that is because the only way to create an experience like one of those is to get a server somewhere and then build a bunch of custom software on top of that server such that everyone comes to that one server to use your service. Like there's just no, and the convenience there, right, is like I can just, for whatever it might be, Notion or pick a service for which there's this amazing convenience, which is like I have it on my phone, I have it on my computer. I have a computer here, I have a computer at my house, I have a computer in my pocket. I never have to take anything with. I find that actually is a convenience amazing, right? You just log in. And that convenience, though, requires that it's in a data center. I mean, there's still physical bits somewhere. Someone's got to deal with that. And so the Urbit sort of thesis is like, well, that's a technical problem. So like, as long as someone else has to run that software stack for whatever service, you're always going to be stuck in this world of like, you have a million of them, and and someone has to run it for you. Uh, does that make sense? This is like the thing that's like it's like the crux of the whole problem. Like the whole Urbit is basically like that sucks. That world is terrible. It's only going to get worse because you rely on someone to do it for you. You have to live in a world where you get the convenience of this thing lives forever and it's always on the network, but it has to actually be yours. If it's not yours, you're never going to get a good user experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense and it's interesting because it raises in my mind a kind of second part to the first thing we talked about. The first thing being like convenience and kind of streamlined quality of what you want your experience to be.
Yeah,
But when you're talking about, okay, I want this capability or this service, but I need to rely on a third party or some company or whatever to
yeah,
to do the work for me, store it or whatever,
yeah,
then I think naturally you start to ask, well, what's the exchange there?
yeah,
Because half the time you're not paying for it,
yeah,
right? Like I don't pay for my Gmail, but
yeah,
then nothing in the world's free. So what's being taken from me in
yeah,
exchange for the service? And that's something,
yeah. There's this.
personally I feel a little bit skeptical of.
You mean in the case of like ordinary, like mainstream services?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I feel like I heard someone the other day making fun of this, though. Like it's become a commonplace of the like, if you're not paying for it, like you're the product. That it's almost like a parody. I don't like. I mean, it's true, but it's also like people have the sort of consciousness around that feels extreme in a way that's almost silly. Like, yeah, dude, we know that. But the question is like, how do you fix it? Not to make
Mm.
fun of, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's like I'm obviously in the position of hearing this so many times. I'm like, it just starts to, I get sick of it because I feel like I don't know. I'm someone who doesn't like to. I'm like enough with the critique. You know, like if you want to solve it, then just fucking solve it. Like it gets a little bit
Yeah.
annoying. But yeah, of course, if you rely on, there's always some exchange, and I actually think maybe another part of my position on this is like most ad-funded services, since I remember their rise, they decided to fund themselves through advertising through what at the time seemed like basically virtuous and totally legitimate reasons, if that makes sense. Like they thought it was a good idea. They
Can
were
you go
like,
into more detail? Yeah.
yeah, so like Google, I always remember Google basically being like, hey, if you're searching for, you know, seaweed snacks or whatever, and we put an ad for seaweed snacks in your search results and you click on it and you get seaweed snacks that you want, that's basically like helping the customer acquire, do what they were already doing with Google. So what's wrong with that? And it's like, well, hold my beer. Like, there's all kinds of fucking problems with that because it becomes such
Yeah.
a corrupting influence on the company and the culture of how you build software that like it's really dangerous. But actually, I couldn't have told anyone. No one really knew that. You know, like there was this intuitive sense. The same thing with like, hey, we're going to read your Gmails to better target ads, but like we'll give you free email. And everyone's like, okay, yeah, sure, maybe. And at the time, I feel like I was like, it doesn't feel, it was more like this intuitive sense of like, that doesn't seem quite right, but it doesn't
Mhm.
play out until years later. So I think the people who implemented it had the right idea. They're like, look, we want to, it's the like, who doesn't want to make the world more open and connected, I mean, I think there are legitimate arguments against it, maybe, but all these things like kind of sound good. It seems like you're helping people, but ultimately, it's like there's something, I don't know. It's just flawed. Like they're all the approaches were ultimately slightly flawed. But I also don't know if people thought about how big these services were going to get and how important they were going to become to people. So basically, all I'm saying is I just don't think it's the like never attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity or whatever. That's not the but what's it? You know what I'm saying?
I,
Like
I feel I feel that. I mean, I get what you're saying there. Yeah.
yeah,
That the origin of it probably is not exactly what it turned out to be.
yeah. It's just like laziness or something. And but to me, the more interesting thing, like the thing like my interest in Urbit is actually as a designer, basically, right? Like I'm like, yeah, the experience we have isn't good. That's obvious, or it should be obvious to most people. But the question is like, well, what's the experience that we could have with computers? And then if you start to imagine some of those potential futures of what it might be like to like actually have all of your technology work for you. I often think about this like in the car. So like cars are pre-wired, but car manufacture like integration between your car and services, it feels really weird because it's like your car like protects your livelihood. Like, do you really want to like log in with Facebook to your car? Like that's fucking creepy as hell. Uh, but there are all kinds of cool things. Like, why don't I just get in my car and like because I'm wearing like my watch, my watch turns on, or it, like, or it can scan
Mhm.
my whatever fingerprint, or there are all kinds of like ways that you could make the physical world like respond to you in interesting ways. You can just to like you can roughly sketch out like all kinds of things like that. Then it's like, well, why can't we do that? And that's in some ways like that's the rabbit hole that led me back towards something like Urbit. It was not like, oh, I don't like the way things are. It was like, look, there are all kinds of cool things you could potentially do with connected computers that have to do with like, can I just store my data forever? I just want to store my notes forever. I don't ever want to worry about like my writing disappearing. I mean, if you
Mhm.
really think hard about that, you're like, well, you can go to sort of elaborate lengths to back it up yourself, and you have like a system of text files and running your own servers, but it's a lot of work and it's not scalable. It
Yeah.
doesn't work for everybody. Uh, so the foundation being flawed just prevents us from like imagining. This is kind of what we were talking about before we like turn this thing on or whatever. But like, yeah, it feels like there's just no way to like imagine what the future of technology could be because the technology we have is like kind of clunky and like actually pretty old and complicated.
Yeah, it's just sort of like built like one brick at a time, like over the course of a very long period. And so sometimes, you step back and you look at it and you're like, wow, this thing doesn't look cohesive at all. it just looks like a pile of like junk.
Yeah. Yeah, the weird thing about that is that, so I used to
But they
often
keep
also,
painting the top layer, so the top layer looks okay.
yeah. You remember like you ever notice like in the subway in New York, like when the paint starts peeling off the poles and the platforms, and it's like
Yeah.
this thick. It's just like, and it's like the whole rainbow.
The thing that reminds me of is, where they put up the ads with like the adhesive backing. I don't
Yeah,
think they actually use wheat paste in the stations, but then they keep tearing them down, and then
yeah,
some of the residue is left. Keep putting them on and on and on, and then every now and then you'll walk by one without a new poster, and it's just like, it looks like a piece of modern art or something. It's so
yeah,
crazy looking.
yeah.
Um,
There's like the whole
but it's
history of,
beautiful because there's no ad there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that like, well, the other distinction though is like that whole weird pastiche of different components that make up any centralized service without getting into what they are. They're all built for get everyone to come to one server. Like that's just the way that whole world operates. It's like I mean, I think I often just describe it as like, it's like industrial scale software or something, like it's, and because it's built for that thing, for like that use case, it's not very useful for individual, like personal computing, basically. Like individual one-to-one, like one person, one machine. They're not compatible. They're totally different things. So to draw back to what I was saying before, like the sort of basic Urbit thesis is like, look, you have all this industrial scale software. It all sits on top of a server, right? Like there is a server somewhere that runs your, it's the backend for your Google Docs. It's the backend for your Facebook. It's the backend for your whatever. This whole complicated stack, it's very industrialized. And underneath that, there's like one foundation. Urbit's like, get rid of the stack, okay, because that's industrialized. That foundation is a commodity now. Like the best part of web services is that we have data centers everywhere. We have this, a bunch of computers that speak the same protocols everywhere. That's amazing. Just reuse that, but build a stack on top of that that's meant for like personal compute, like one to one person, one computer. Um,
So Urbit is a replacement of the stack that
Basically,
you're
yeah.
describing,
Like,
not a replacement of the foundation.
right. We're like the foundation, like Unix plus the internet, which is like what every server runs, your laptop, your phone mostly. I mean, what most internet connected devices have some form of Unix and an internet connection. We're like, that's fine. Okay, that's not going anywhere. It's like a commodity thing. We can build on top of that, and then we'll build a stack that is meant for a person, not for like, for one to one, not for like one to n. Does that make sense? I always wonder
So
whether that's like this is like the core thesis that I've always been wondered whether you could make it intelligible outside of like, I think for technical people it's like pretty obvious, but
I mean, as a non-technical person, I mean, I can visualize what you're describing, but now I'm just curious, like, apart from just describing it as being personal
yeah,
versus industrial, like, what are the differences between these two stacks, and like, what makes one more
yeah,
better suited for me than the
yeah.
other one?
Okay, well, also reminds me like another way to think about it, right, is like um, it's like the difference between a train and a car or something, right? Like if you want to let
Hmm.
someone go anywhere and do what they have to be able to drive anywhere, you're not even going to force them to drive on asphalt. Like they can literally just do anything with it.
Right.
The whole like sort of technology stack, whatever, like the technical architecture of what a car is just totally different than, we borrow some things, pistons, I guess, like some forms of like mechanical components, but for the most part, they're completely different. Whereas like a
Hmm.
train runs only on rails, it can only transport many people at once. So in the Urbit case, it's like the thing that I care about as a designer basically is more or less the user experience that you get. Just you rip the Wi-Fi out of your laptop, or you get yourself an Apple II or a Mac or whatever, like general purpose computing, just as like this, I can take programs, recombine them, move data between them, and sort of explore what's possible with a computer as a tool. that's such a valuable resource in terms of how we imagine who we are, like how we connect with other people, and it has to be open-ended. And so there's never going to be anything when you build a service, you have to kind of like determine. It's like you just sort of like decide on the rails. You decide on like the interface, like how can someone send messages in one way or another, and what are the things, if anything, that other people could extend the service to do. So, Facebook had apps for a while. They're mostly gone, I think. Instagram is completely monolithic. Twitter pretty much monolithic. I guess they had an API at one point, but they just do one thing. But what I care about is that like a person can do lots of things. They can just like do whatever they want. So the characteristic difference is sort of like Urbit is an open-ended tool. It's meant to be open-ended, and it's meant to be useful to you as like something where you can do whatever you want with it. That's like its most valuable. That's the value proposition. Like this is yours to do whatever you want with it, versus like this is this very efficient machine for doing one thing.
So when you're talking about, I can do anything I want with it, and you're using this metaphor of like the train and the car, the
Yeah.
comparison between the two. Obviously, I love or I prefer the idea of driving my own car than being on a
Yeah.
train.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm curious, not necessarily where Urbit is at right now, but when you talk about something, something so open-ended in terms of what the possibilities are, like what am I going to be able to use Urbit for down the
Yeah.
road?
Yeah. So like we don't have any totally innovative answers to that question, or maybe how you answer that question. Meaning, historically the way this is done is like you build a system that is extensible and then let developers who are technical enough to experiment with it build things and distribute them to the users of that system. And they kind of create the building blocks that users can then use to go and sort of do whatever they want. So can you do anything? Well, in some ways it's constrained by, are you going to build your own software or not? But on an open
Right.
platform, if anyone can ship software to it, then the building blocks that you are given are much richer than whatever, like sort of a company that can only sell ads or whatever is ever going to give you. So
Okay, that's
you
interesting.
see,
So it's
yeah, go
really
ahead.
dependent on people who adopt this as a platform. Then.
It's dependent on, well, so it's dependent in some ways on, okay, so I mean, basically, yes, let's see. Urbit has slightly strange incentive models, or that are unlike, well, they're more like, no, it's pretty weird. They're a little bit more like selling physical computers, but it's weird because there's no hardware involved, obviously, and it's the whole thing as a collective. So let's see. We're the primary developers. Like right now, I think of like Urbit's a system. It comes with one floppy disk, which is Landscape, which is this application for communicating and collaborating, keeping in touch, whatever, building community. Landscape is actually reasonably open-ended by comparison to its kind of cousins in the form of like Slack or Discord or whatever. Meaning, when I create a Landscape group, the degree of freedom that I have is pretty high in terms of like I can control the permissions and channel types and stuff. You can get pretty baroque in terms of like what you can make with Landscape. And the idea is to kind of push that as far as we can. The thinking being that like our incentive is to deliver something to people that they think is useful. And well, that's a crazy. Sorry, I just got a YouTube chat question that's
Cool.
throwing me off. Someone remembers me from an old like internet forum, which I was indeed a part of. Uh, uh, okay, anyway, I totally lost my train of thought, or this is derailing. Where was I? Oh yeah, basically just like Landscape is meant to deliver value to the person who uses it, not like to keep them around as long as possible, right? And that's true. So and that's true broadly. It's like if people build software for Urbit, um, the idea is, you know, it should just be useful. It doesn't need to, you're not going to make money on your like engagement numbers, basically. Um,
Right.
so that's sort of a different thing.
I,
We could talk about like the
I
economics. I'm sort of coursing over like the economics of Urbit because that's sort of part of it.
no, I guess just as someone who is interested in using Urbit and wanting to know more about it, but then for most of my day-to-day internet activity, I'm kind of curious, like at what point or how I could just stop using the stuff that I use now because
Yeah, yeah,
Urbit will just take care of all that stuff for me. Simple
yeah,
as, I don't know, like sending files to somebody or,
yeah.
sharing pictures. You know.
So the first, um, let's see, two things. Um, the first bar to, I mean, what we can do now is what we sort of do ourselves. Like we use Urbit, right, for like day-to-day communication and collaboration and stuff. But we managed to, unsurprisingly, convince everyone at the company to like use Urbit day to day. And so if you have a group of friends you can convince, you can use this totally private to you durable thing that you have control over to communicate, keep in touch. Actually, not that different than, or to sort of run a forum, there's some of the spirit of like early internet forum stuff that I was involved in, like baked into what Landscape is. But there's no like the onboarding and inviting part of it is super tough, right? It's like high barrier to entry. It's siloed off from the rest of the internet. I mean, it's kind of like if you want to get your friends to like use a new messenger, you're like, hey, you guys should
Mm,
really use Signal, but like you have to get them to sign up for Signal. Um,
right.
so the first thing
I
I
think isn't
think,
that
yeah, go ahead.
isn't that like where the challenge lies? That even if
Yeah.
people are using things that are imperfect, they're kind of used to them, and sometimes people are they would rather use the imperfect thing
Oh yeah.
than and just adopt an entirely new thing because it involves using their brain to
Yeah.
like
Well,
learn
it's just
something.
it takes time. It's annoying.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, but I mean, let's see. Um, Yes, so the main thing is just to make it really easy. I should be able to like send you a link, get you to just claim an invite and get onboarded really quickly and easily without really thinking about it. Like at first you should be able to use Urbit as if it's just like another app. And it's like very calm, it's powerful, it feels good, and it should be nicer to use than some alternative. And idea being that like we can, because our focus is just to deliver a good user experience, like we should be able to at least build an early network effect there. Then ideally you get other people to explore what's possible building on this new platform. Um, and you start to win just like on features. It's like, look, there's stuff you can do with Urbit that you couldn't do on an ordinary platform. But Urbit coexists with the existing sort of mainstream internet for a long time. Um,
Mm.
but the long-term vision is to get close to this like WeChat, like, oh wait, no, in your case, Line, right?
Cacao.
Kakao Talk, yeah, sorry, Line is in
Yeah.
Japan. Uh, Not to stereotype, just the super
No,
apps
no,
have
no.
their communities or whatever. Yeah,
I mean,
Kakao
to be
Talk's like
honest, even
it's
even
amazing.
yeah, even with Cacao, I mean, I my use of it is so like elementary. I just use the chat feature basically. But
But you must have
but
family
I'm
members
aware
that
that
are
there's
like,
like an
yeah,
ecosystem there. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
The super apps are really cool, and I think that's kind of like that's the first major milestone for Urbit is to get to that point of like anyone
Mhm.
can think of it like it's a super app that's private and secure that anyone can ship an extension to. Um, and yeah, maybe for a while lives on your phone alongside other things. And you can see then, that's maybe I always think of it like what we have now is sort of like an Apple II. The sort of Kakao Talk version of Urbit is like a Macintosh. And then you start to try and push forward to like you actually maybe ship Android phones with Urbit as like the primary interface. And you try and sort of like push further towards maybe Urbit talks to all of your legacy services, which would be great, which is like a hard engineering problem, but it's doable. Um, And
What sort of
then
time frame are you looking at with what you're talking about right now?
my hope is to do, uh, you get to like let people ship other things to Urbit other than landscape, like easy landscape onboarding later this year, like during the year. Very rudimentary, you can ship a floppy disk over the network kind of thing. Also later this year. I'd say like Kakao Talk version of Urbit, 2 years, maybe a year, 18 months away.
Oh, okay.
Like in a rudimentary form, maybe 2 years. And then, but that's like, then that could go on for some time, you know. I mean, it's not like I'm looking for another job or something. Like, this is it.
Yeah.
uh,
Well, going back to something we were talking about earlier, just in terms of like using all these other services, something that, it always kind of bothered me, uh, but I don't know if I just kind of being unreasonable about it is, if I take pictures per se, or
yeah,
let's say I'm working on video and, you have like raw files and you want to work with someone via the or over the internet and share things that ideally someone else wouldn't like own or have a copy of it
yeah,
somewhere.
yeah,
Um, it's like the idea of, okay, if my editor lived next door to me, I just,
yeah,
have files on a hard drive. I walk next door, he plugs them in, the
yeah,
computer's, it's air gapped. Then I never have a worry that my stuff is somewhere else and I don't know where it is.
yeah,
But the thing that's always bothered me about services like Dropbox or whatever we
yeah,
transfer is that I'm sorry, I'm not reading the tiny type before I click agree.
yeah.
I don't have time for
You're just
that.
envisioning
So
the like legion of Dropbox employees like watching your.
no, I mean it'd be absurdly it'd be so vain to think anyone would care about like the thing that I'm working on. But
Yeah,
just in theory, you know, because as someone who's
yeah,
interested in film, I hear stories all the time about like, oh, Orson Welles or like Stanley Kubrick, they had some script that they wrote decades
yeah,
ago and it never got made, and somebody digs it up in a copy up in a box, and then someone ends up buying the rights and making
yeah,
this film, and it's kind of like they probably didn't want that thing to see the light of day, which is why
yeah,
it
yeah,
never got made in the first place. But
yeah,
it's so frustrating to think that if it's out there, you know, there is the possibility of it being used in a way that's like against what you want.
yeah.
It's like my English teacher used to always say, like, if you write
That's interesting.
journals,
Yeah.
like burn them, like just burn them. Don't wait. Don't put it in your will. Like,
Really?
don't wait until whatever. Yeah, yeah.
My
She used
journals
to
are
just say that.
definitely. I like look forward to people digging up my journals, and
Really?
I'm gone, man. I think it's like that's. Well, I hear what you're saying, so I'm just. I think it's a good point, and actually, yeah. I mean, it's something we care a lot about. Like, everyone, you should have the right to burn your journals, or maybe I'm not gonna tell it. Like yeah. Uh, let's see. Um, yeah, there's a weird. So even with there's a trend of basically like privacy focused services, right? And those privacy focused services, for the most part, do like client side encryption, right? So the server only sees an encrypted version of your messages, which for file storage is totally not feasible. And so no one's really done that. But I would say like even in the client, so it's a totally reason. It just feels weird um, to have the potential for someone to look at whatever it is you're doing, even if you're like like you're not uh, you're neither like a terrorist or someone at a three-letter agency or whatever. You can come up with these choke point, characters or whatever, where they're like, oh, in this situation, obviously, you need privacy. It's like, look, privacy just feels good. Okay, it doesn't even. It's just you just don't want to have to worry about it exactly as you describe, I think.
Right.
Um, and I would say even the current like technology we have for that. being kind of like Signal, Telegram, whatever, client-side encryption. Yeah, well, someone still runs the server and uh, and controls what client you use, and so it just feels like not quite good enough. Like you could do better. Um,
Mhm.
and so yeah, an Urbit world of like, if I need to send you something, like the only two people who ever actually got a copy of it were you and I. Like it was sure you could have the proverbial Eve,
Yeah.
like someone could eavesdrop on our communications and get an encrypted version of it, but you know that's like
I mean, that's the version of digital life that I want,
yeah,
you
it
know?
feels right.
Just
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, it's like if I was to like send you a letter, for whatever
yeah,
reason I didn't feel like emailing you, and I go to the post office and I send it. It's like I don't ever think that someone's gonna like open the
yeah,
letter and make a Xerox and then put it back in and then
yeah, yeah, yeah.
put it in a box somewhere that says like, this person sent this letter that I have a
Yeah,
file.
it's such a funny. This is such a. I feel like I have an enormous amount of respect for the like privacy and security community, like in the world of technology. Like people take this stuff really seriously, but I feel like they almost always are thinking about sort of like user profiles that are just so extreme. Like instead of like what most people want is just a simplicity. They just want it to be straightforward. They don't care about, like in the post office example, it's like someone at the post office could read your letter, but like you pretty
Right.
much trust the post office, and so it's actually okay. Like it's okay for us to have a little bit of trust in the institutions that we depend on, but
Mm.
we want like to have it's more like we want to have an intuition for like how things are working inside. And I feel like a lot of
Mm.
our systems are like really they're like, they have this very complicated engineering to ensure absolute trust, basically. And that
Mm.
feels like, I don't know, I'm often like suspicious that's exactly the way to go. Or it feels like over engineered sometimes. But anyway, yeah, I mean, the idea with Urbit is definitely to just like, you know, I mean, in some ways, our hope is to be able to get to that level of, to both satisfy the, things should be as audited to be as secure as possible, and pass
Mm.
every sort of security bar that we possibly can, but also be just intuitively correct. Like when we share data, no one else sees it because no one else needs to see it. Um,
Right.
yeah,
So when you ask the question like what is Urbit, right?
yeah,
Um, or is Urbit Apple? Is Urbit a Mac? Is Urbit
yeah, yeah.
the OS?
No,
Like
yeah.
what exactly is it?
Urbit is like Unix in a way, right? Like, and maybe Tlon is more like Apple or whatever. Sam's, like is a company. Both
Mm.
Apple and Samsung like use Unix in different capacities inside of the products that they make. So
Mm.
Urbit is just a piece of technology. It's also a network. Like Urbit is an operating system, and the protocol by which instances of that operating system communicate. So like when you boot one on your computer, it can talk to mine. And then in order to keep that network of nodes friendly, basically, and to fund its development, we say to boot this OS, you need an ID, and there's a finite number of these IDs. So they cost something. The cost means you need some skin in the game to get on the network, so you can't just be a spammer or a troll. And when you pay that cost, you're helping pay for the development of this system to make it better. Um,
Mm. So you're a
uh,
stakeholder.
yeah.
You're a stakeholder in the thing.
Yeah, exactly. So like the cool thing
Yeah.
about that in the long run, right, is like you imagine it's like right now, like who owns the internet? It's actually kind of a complicated answer. Like there are people who own parts of the networking or like own and sort of regulate the networking itself. There are people who own the sort of like server layer at the level of infrastructure like AWS or GCP. And then of course there are people who actually own and control your data like services that you use, but still relatively centralized versus like in an Urbit world where there are infrastructure nodes that are relatively high value, but they are pretty distributed, probably more distributed than the internet today. And then, when you own an address, it's not like my Gmail address, which could very well disappear. I have like, I can't care about it too much in a way, right? Who knows?
Mhm.
Um, and versus in an Urbit world, right, where it's like I own it with a key, it's mine. Maybe I let someone host it for me, but I should be able to get it back at any point. Um,
Mhm.
and there's all kinds of weird social implications of that, I think, that we don't necessarily understand yet. It's sort of like, I think the design is good. Does it? How does it play out? It's like, we'll find out.
Yeah, it's just kind of always been kind of interesting to me that we, for whatever reason, I feel like we accept things in the digital realm that we would never accept in the physical realm. In terms
Yeah,
of
because
just
they're
like
not
handing
legible.
things over.
Yeah,
Right, right. But it's
good
just
point,
that's the
actually.
path that we've kind of just collectively strolled down, now for how many decades that, I think at a certain point people just you don't ask like why the sky is blue,
Yeah.
just
It's kind of related to the thing we were talking about before we started, though, like where there's some part of that that I feel like it comes from, like, for as much as people have, there's this new consciousness of like I'm sort of uncomfortable with my, my relationship to big companies that hold my data or whatever, right? Like maybe that's become a bit of a meme, but
mm,
in general, like if you look at the way that people act, people seem to be manifesting, a kind of Blade Runner like cyberpunk future where you just have this kind of like everything is states have disappeared in lieu of giant companies that control everything. And I've always been like on the side of, well, if you want to move away from something like that, you have to give people the ability to make choices that are based on uh, that are almost like product level choices. Like I want to use this thing because it's nicer to use, not because I believe in the
mm.
world that it's going to manifest, but because it's actually uh, a better world, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's like just it just improves the quality of their
yes,
of their
everyday life. It's
day-to-day
like
life.
this cat. You're
Yeah,
just like, oh, I like this better.
yeah.
So I don't know whether
Well, I
people are
think.
ever gonna like do it in a principled way.
Mm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I can't speak for everyone else, but that's something that definitely appeals to me about the kind of the cleanliness of what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
Just in terms of like the aesthetics.
Oh yeah.
Just because I don't know, I'm sure there's some people who, they go shopping and then they want to leave you know, their Louis Vuitton bag out on their table or whatever for long after it has to be there just because they love it so much. But like I, for one, don't like seeing logos very much,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like it it's like I want something because I need it or whatever, but I
Yeah.
don't need to constantly be reminded of like the brand that
Yeah,
gave
we
it to
we
me.
often talk about like internally the model is basically Muji. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
Muji is basically like unbranded quality goods. It's like you should just have really high quality digital service, like digital tools that are totally unbranded, and you use them because they're super high quality. Um, I think
Does it
that's the
seem to
like,
you like that's something that stems more from like the East? Because you brought up Muji, and then I immediately thought of like
yeah,
Uniqlo,
yeah,
and it's like, and then I thought of a Western corollary, like maybe like the Gap at its peak. But
yeah,
then
yeah,
the
yeah.
Gap was also so like prominently branded too. You think about those like the sweatshirts from when we were younger, with the big letters on the front, and it's kind of like somehow they couldn't
Yeah,
just be like the blank. They had to
yeah.
like put the branding on top of it.
It's a good
Um,
question. I mean, IKEA is very successful, somewhat branded, but in when it's in your home, it's very unbranded. Like, I don't know, man. There's something very
Also, their
boom.
Scandinavian roots, for some reason, I put them
Yeah,
in their own category a little bit.
yeah. But I mean, they're palatable to Western consumers, I think.
Sure.
There's, I feel like branding is indicative of a kind of like decadence and or something that is kind of old world. Like I'm just like, I don't know, like do people really want to live in that world? That world is old. It's it's not. I don't know. It doesn't feel like the future to me, basically.
Um, yeah, maybe it's for people whose identities are kind of constructed upon,
Yeah, that's true. But you could also build, brands can exist. Urbit is meant you could build branded software and ship it to Urbit. That's okay. We're fine with that.
Oh, okay. Cool. Okay. So going back to a question earlier of like if I just want to share a file, send a video clip to
Yeah.
another Urbit user,
Yeah.
um, that would basically mean that somewhere along the way, some people on Urbit decided to develop a piece
Sure.
of
Yeah.
software that they basically made their own version of like some file
Yeah.
transfer thing.
Yeah, and
And
we'll
then I'd have to
probably
just download that and install it on my Urbit and then
yeah, like a really broad, like high level way to think about it would be like file sharing is definitely the kind of is like a very basic, is a Muji like component, like we'll probably
mm,
work on stuff like that. So when it comes to like, basic components of communication, it's like communication, commerce, collaboration. Those are things we care a lot about. Just having those components exist in a very plain and straightforward way. If someone wanted to come along and create the, TikTok of Urbit, that's a very very specific branded thing,
mm.
because it's like I don't know, it's its own thing. Dude, I just realized I got to go do something else because I
Wow. Okay.
fucked up
Yeah.
on like,
Yeah. We
uh,
hit an hour here.
yeah, that was fun though. Thanks
Okay.
for,
Thanks for having me. I
I
hope
should have,
my ignorance has, been of
maybe we
some
should
benefit to
let's do
somebody
this
out
again
there.
in a week and then we'll make you be the, you'll explain.
I don't know about that, but yeah, we'll talk about it.
Cool.
All right,
Anyway, yeah,
man.
thanks for
Yeah.
doing
Well,
this. It's
thanks for having
helpful
me.
to me
Yeah.
and it's fun to do. Um,
Cool. All right, man.
uh, and yeah, you can, whatever. If I hadn't run out of time, I would.